How can a smartwatch reduce running injuries like plantar fasciitis or patellofemoral pain syndrome? In this video, we'll learn how a smartwatch can be used to inform us on load management strategies for running, and then also how we can use it for gait retraining purposes. The most obvious way is to use a smartwatch to monitor both the distance and time of your runs. And you could use this information to inform your running progressions by calculating both the acute and the chronic training loads. Acute training load is the cumulative running volume over a week, or it can also be a singular run, whereas a chronic training load is typically the average over 4 weeks. This is helpful to avoid sudden spikes in load, as this has been associated with an increased risk of injury. So if we wanted to calculate our chronic workload, for example, let's say that every week we ran 3 times and each run was 5 miles. So each week we're running 15 miles, and then if we did that for 4 weeks, that's 15 miles per week. Well, if we're looking at increasing our mileage by 10 to 20% per week at the end of that 4 weeks, then we'd be looking to run somewhere around 16 to 18 miles in that week for our acute workload. But let's say if we tried to increase by too much and we ran 25 miles in that 5th week, well, that's a very large increase and we'd be setting ourselves up for potential injury. And this is especially important if we're looking at returning back from an injury where our chronic workload has been reduced. Let's say in that example that we had to take 2 weeks off because we had an injury. So we ran 15 miles, got injured, and then 0. So actually our chronic workload over that 4 weeks is going to be 7.5, which means that we're going to have to reduce our running volume by about half, so that way we're not increasing our load too much, potentially leading us to a re-injury after our injury. And for most people, this is the extent that they would use a smartwatch to help measure their training load, but this actually doesn't tell the entire picture. A big part of this is actually the intensity of the runs, because we know that a low intensity 5-mile run is not the same if we're doing a hill run for 5 miles. And one way to measure intensity is to use ratings of perceived exertion, which is a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being at rest and 10 being maximal effort. But using a smartwatch provides a more accurate way of measuring intensity by using our heart rate. So to calculate your training load while taking into account intensity, what you would do is you would take your distance and multiply it by your heart rate. So for example, if we were doing a 5-mile run and our heart rate was 150 on average, then our training load would be 750. And typically we actually divide this by 10 just to make the numbers more simple. So our training load would then therefore be 75. And what's cool is it looks like the new Apple Watch update is going to take all this information to give you some insight into your training load. And it looks like it's going to give you the 7-day as well as 28-day span. So it's going to give you the acute and the chronic workloads. But since the update just came out, I actually don't have enough information on it yet to see what it's like. But if you want to see a video on that in the future, leave a comment down below. Finally, let's talk about how a smartwatch can be used for gait retraining purposes, like changing our step rate. When it comes to load management, especially for injuries, there's been a large emphasis on step rate. This is because it's been shown that increasing your step rate can decrease the loads on various tissues. So for example, with the plantar fascia, increasing your step rate by 5% reduces the load on the plantar fascia by 2 to 8%. Then if we look at the patellofemoral joint, which is the knee, increasing your step rate by 5 to 10% decreases the load on the knee by 11 to 22%. And since both of these are overload conditions, reducing the cumulative load on these tissues over the course of a run can be very beneficial. While having real-time feedback on our smartwatch would be helpful in knowing what our step rate is, unfortunately this isn't always available. So instead you might have to look at a previous run to see what your step rate is and then calculate what a 5 to 10% increase would be. And then a trick is to take whatever that target step rate is and look for a playlist that has the same beats per minute. And this way when you run, you'll actually sync to the music to increase your step rate. So hopefully this video on how to use a smartwatch to monitor your training load and change your step rate was helpful. If you want to see more running content, watch this video over here, and to stay up to date, subscribe to the channel.